Why has it become so important for us to focus on the future? We live in a VUCA world, that is, one that is full of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. This has created a heightened need for organizations to increase their agility and responsiveness to these constant changes. In this episode of Think Like a Futurist, we explore the fact that in order for organizations to not only survive in their increasingly competitive business environments, but also to thrive, there is an urgent need for them to be able to imagine the future through divergent scenarios. Doing so enables organizations to make robust strategic choices which are more likely to withstand an exponentially more competitive future, and to keep strategies more adaptable to unforeseen scenarios. Our guest today is Ann Boysen, a professional futurist whose work includes consulting for Fortune 500 companies in market forecasting, brand strategy, and product development. Ann uses strategic foresight to help prepare clients for a future that will shape and be shaped by younger generations. Hi, Ann, and welcome to Culture Matters.
Thank you for having me.
What I'd like to do to start off with is if you can share about your journey to becoming a futurist.
Yeah, that's an interesting journey. As a matter of fact, I came out of political science and geography, and before I decided to get my master's in strategic foresight. I came to the United States to pursue a PhD in political science. And then I discovered this interesting field called future studies, is what it was called back then. And I thought, what's better than studying the future? Because that's where I am planning to spend the rest of my life. That's the most current thing you can engage your time in, I was thinking. I transferred and I got my master's degree in future studies. We now call it strategic foresight from the University of Houston. I've been working as a solo consultant, and I've been working with some other teams, very interesting teams along the way, across many different industries, engaged with many different types of objectives and goals, ideating next new product, how to hire the people of the future and how to engage them. So it's been a very heterogeneous journey and very interesting, very difficult to pin down and say that it's like one thing.
Oh, it sounds fascinating, starting off in social sciences and then transitioning or moving across into future studies or foresight. Maybe you can explain for any of our viewers who aren't familiar with futurism or foresight, maybe you can tell us a bit more about this field.
Foresight is, in essence, the strategy that you employ, the different strategic approaches that you may employ to make decision given uncertainty. Because the only thing that we know for certain about the future is that it's uncertain. So it's the various ways in trying to navigate that landscape where there's so many changing variables and where you don't know how this confluence of various forces come together and create completely different futures. So what we do very often is that we create scenarios and we look at we have sort of like a very open 360 view where we look at changes that are happening in many different areas of life, of society, whether that is related to social movements or culture or technology or environment. We look at all of those things and we try to synthesize them in interesting ways so that we get different scenarios. It's as much an art as it is a science. I have possibly been more on the sciencey part or the data-driven part. I like to use data in novel ways, put them together, use different machine learning models and different statistical models to try and understand how are these emerging trends coming along, so that you can kind of see what's happening now and see what might happen in the future based on what we're seeing right now. My main concern is on the generational change, which is people. And people are sticky. They don't change very quickly. When you really focus on human change, it's slower. In one way, it's harder to get data about it, but it's also easier to get data about it. In order to really understand how humans change the future, you have to really do a lot of data analysis. And so I have this approach where I combine traditional foresight strategies together with data science or methods that are deriving from data science.
Fascinating. I mean, this is something that not many people know about. So thank you for sharing your insights. You mentioned a very good point there, right, about people. We know that most people don't like change, but change is coming, right? We can't predict the future. It's uncertain. The only certainty is uncertainty, as you said. So how do you help people and organizations prepare for the future?
Scenario planning is one technique that many futurists are employing. That's really just the last step. That's like when you've been working with a project for some time and you're trying to figure out how might the future for this particular organization look like. I come in usually at an earlier point. I'll do a lot of data work, so I look at early signals of change, but specifically I look at generational change. So a lot of the trends that I collect are somehow related to generational change. It's somehow related to how different generations do things differently. One is that very often the social changes that we think are going to take place, because we humans are so change resistant, as you said, very often the big changes happen when a new generation enters a new life phase. So it's not just because you get a young generation coming into adult society, but it's also because those who are adults today, they enter the next level of adulthood. And those who are like older adults, they enter senior level. So these people are bringing with them a lot of different perceptions and a lot of different habits and a lot of different ways of viewing the world around them. And when that is entering a new life phase, that's really when you see the big changes. Now that requires a methodology that has to do with weak signals, identifying weak signals, like where can we hunt for those early signs that something is changing, something is shifting. For example, there could be a new social medium, it could be a new hashtag campaign for that matter, it could be a new protest, it could be a new brand strategy, because brands are very good at trying to tap into those changes. And then you combine that with more traditional statistical work where you look at how are different people changing over time, and how is, for example, if you take one cohort today, the people who are maybe 20 today, how are they different from people who were 20 years ago? Is there something fundamental that has changed? That is not only because time itself changes, but that is something that might speak a little bit to how we change as human beings. There's a lot of changes that are taking place around humans, but it's really when many humans are coming together in groups and creating this big movement and this momentum, that's really when you see big societal change. And that could be me being a little bit influenced by my social science background, that I tend to think that humans are the ones that are really creating those big changes.
Relates a lot, I guess, to organizations nowadays. Some of the challenges they face are the so-called intergenerational gap or divide. I never thought of it that way, that it's not just about the age of the demographic or that group, it's actually the phase of life that they're in. So that's something that we need to consider as well. I know you've done quite a bit of work or research on culture. Could you share some insights on your views on that?
Culture is always the hardest, I think, because it's, again, I'm very data driven and it's hard to get data about it. How do you measure culture? So there's a few metrics that you can use, for example, engagement, but that's a very crude metrics. You can kind of see how is one generation shifting from the one before, how are they consuming some types of culture different from people that were young before, but then that's a very consumer-centered type. One of the main trends that you can see with the youngest generation is that they're very co-creative. They don't want to have a product delivered to them. Somebody sitting in a high tower deciding that, oh, we think that this is what you want, because they very much want to have a part in that. So they want to be part of creating the end product. And there's a lot of brands that have tapped into that. So they've been creating these co-creative platforms where you can hyper customize a product for yourself. You've had some shows, even, Netflix shows was Bandersnatch that decided okay, we're going to try to see if people can create their own ending and they can sort of transform the storyline to a way that they want to see it. and to play around with what happens, and then they get taken into these various scenarios themselves. It's an interesting approach in the way that it teaches people to not accept the status quo, but to see that there are many ways of doing things. So young people are taken for granted that they have a lot more influence over both the products that they're using and also the platforms that they're using. So we're seeing this with influencer, for example, that it's not the big enterprises that are deciding who are going to get the most attention, who are media going to treat to become the next celebrities. It's bottom-up driven, it's grassroots driven, it's the people themselves. They're sitting in rooms like this with unprofessional equipment. And so they're creating these videos, and then they create an audience. And it's very driven by the generation itself. There's a certain level of power to that. You have far more influence than other people had at the same age before them, unless they had auditioned for Disney or something. So it's a very interesting way to see how they're using the power. They really are using it, because you can see that reflected even in the brand strategies, that the way that brands now are not only reaching out to their market, especially if they're marketing younger people, but they have to be transparent in their whole strategy, like everything from the marketing message itself to the supply chain to subcontractors. That the whole supply chain has to reflect the values very often that this younger generation has. And this is a very values-driven generation. So we've seen this with, again, to pick on Nike, with much more engagement with social justice. We've seen it with Ben & Jerry's, Patagonia. There's a lot of brands that are appealing, not now understanding that this is the way to appeal to this younger generation. We have to take them seriously. It's whatever they put on their screens, whatever they put on their TikTok screens. That's what's going to set the zeitgeist for how the big brands are going to operate.
Reflects this shift from top down to bottom up. It's very much co-creation and this sort of communal spirit. And this, leads into organizations, right? So I'd like to maybe chat for a little bit about leadership, what leaders need to know to prepare for the future. What are some of the pointers or strategies that you can share for leaders?
And one of the things that we have seen with this youngest generation and millennials before them, they really want to very often enter those leadership roles very quickly. And I think it's driven by this idea that, well, we understand this technology. We can just come in and we can make the changes, and we really need to be the ones in charge. I think it's a little problematic to put a 20-year-old in charge. You can't do that. Like there's a level of just life experiences in itself. So it's not enough to just come out of Stanford or Harvard and say, hey, I've been through this program. I know how to do things. I'm young. I'm energetic. I want to make these changes. Give me the board seat right now. I think it's becoming more of an expectation. And I definitely think that they need to be included in the leadership, but the decision-making must be reflected of people in many different generations, because sometimes what you see is that when a younger generation enters a new life stage, sometimes it's overlooked that a problem that they're faced with has been a similar version of that happened in the past. So that if you have someone who's actually been through it before, they're actually able to say that, hey, we can't do that. This is not the way to go. We need to go here instead. And at the same time, if you only have people of higher age, they might be a little bit too resistant, be a little bit too burned by their past experiences. So what you really need is a combination. I think the key word is actually diversity and age diversity, like to make sure that we need those young voices, because they have grown up with this technology. They know, they have this innate feeling of what needs to change for the future. And they're possibly willing to give it another try, even though you burned yourself last time. And for the older people to be there and say, okay, I'll look at this, but we can't do it the way we did it last time because it didn't work out. We have to do it a different way or something.
That ties in also with HR, right? When it comes to people matters or people issues, how do you see things panning out based on your research and your work with regards to the workforce and, like you said, having the younger generations coming in?
At least in the United States, we're seeing a much more diverse generation. The younger people are much more diverse than older generations, especially lately. A strong move towards diversity and inclusion. So DI issues is something every organization is going to have to tackle. I know that there's been a lot of work, a lot of focus on that lately, especially the larger organizations, that they want to make sure that they're specifically hiring people from diverse backgrounds, and that they are implementing inclusion policies to make sure that, they stick around, that they don't just, leave the organization. So this is important. And then you get equity in that effort as well. So this is something that we will be continuing to see. Women are going to demand, young women are far more demanding and, reaching those positions that were once only available to men and to very often white males. Lately, there's been an emphasis on demographic diversity, and we're going to continue to see that for some time, to make sure that we have the demographic representation of different races, different ethnicities, different genders, and hopefully also different age groups. One thing I think possibly might be the next step is to ensure diversity in perspectives and worldviews. It's good to not have too much divergence later in a product process, because then you can it takes too long. But at the same time, you need to have enough diversity at the beginning of a process, because otherwise you could very easily end up with these blinders and going down the wrong alley. So there's actually company incentives to ensure that we have diversity of opinion, diversity of worldviews. Unfortunately, at the moment, we're moving in the opposite direction, I think, because we are increasingly separating ourselves into these silos where we are getting this funnel views of what reality looks like. We have actually reached a point where on some areas people cannot even agree on the facts. This is becoming a difficult problem, and it's driven by algorithms that are learning how we work and how we think, and then it kind of gradually customize us, and it kind of pushes us down one particular rabbit hole versus entering those spaces of serendipity where we meet other people with different viewpoints, etc. And I think that is definitely one area that needs to be tackled. And I think that there will be programs to help move that along eventually. There are, for example, different ways it really comes down to what we call recommender systems, because recommender systems on platforms and digital platforms mean that algorithms that are learning what you have done before and what other people like you have done before. And so it can either guide you into a more sort of specific route, or it can do the opposite. It can actually suggest to you to get a wider array. Like you can get more diversity in your choices. And there are platforms that are actually doing that very successfully. So if you look at music streaming platforms like Spotify, they are using that approach, the diversity approach, where you listen to this music, or maybe let's open door for some other categories, and they're trying to pull you into different directions so you can actually expand your music choices. And I'm wondering if we're actually going to move away from this polarization that we have today to possibly, expand that. The reason that I think this is important for organizations, it's in these organizations' own interest. It doesn't help that you have diversity on the outside if you don't have diversity on the inside, like in our heads. You have to have that as well. And you have to be able to have uncomfortable conversations with people you don't agree with.
Thanks for sharing that. It's very interesting to know. I think a lot of people have watched the Netflix series, The Social Dilemma, right? So they're already thinking about how AI and machine learning is sort of helping them make choices or trying to influence their decisions and what they look at and read and consume in terms of content. And you're right, with this incredible polarization happening around the world, how do you get different viewpoints to come together? Because without that, there's not going to be much innovation, right?
Right, exactly. When things become very fragmented, you cannot scale a product portfolio. Like you need to have a market, not necessarily the same, but where they share a common interest. And if we become so fragmented that we can't even agree on what the facts are, then it's going to be difficult.
So what will happen is you sort of end up targeting specific sectors or segments and not the bigger market, or you might be so focused on one end that you miss opportunities in the other end, right?
Exactly. That's exactly what you do. Yeah.
Ann has highlighted some drivers and uncertainties that could influence the future. As the baby boomer generation is retiring, organizations will have to shift their business models and strategies to recruit and retain a digital native millennial workforce. This creates a fundamental change in the way our labor market will operate, as employers compete for talent and seek to replace the loyalty, skill sets, and networks lost. While it can't be claimed that millennials are specifically more demanding than baby boomers, what can be said is that they are more vocal about their views and needs and more likely to leave an organization which doesn't satisfy or address those needs. One of the key strategies for organizations and leadership is to increase the diversity and representation during the decision-making process. We look forward to you joining us for part 2 of this Think Like a Futurist episode, as we get a basic understanding of strategic foresight and how you can prepare your organization for an uncertain future.